Sunsets and Silver Spurs by Julian Rhodes. The autumn wind whispered through the cottonwoods as Margaret Blackwood stepped down from the stagecoach, her boots landing firmly in the dusty street of Silver Creek, Colorado. The year was 1875, and like the newly laid railroad tracks that stretched across the landscape, her life was about to take an unexpected turn. She straightened her traveling dress, a practical navy wool that had served her well on the journey from Philadelphia. The small frontier town sprawled before her, its wooden buildings standing proud against the backdrop of purple mountains. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but after her father's passing and the revelation of his mounting debts, she had little choice but to accept her uncle's invitation to help manage his general store. "Miss Blackwood?" A deep voice caught her attention. She turned to find a tall man approaching, his stride confident but unhurried. Unlike the other men on the street, he wore no gun belt but rather a well-worn leather apron. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to reveal strong forearms, marked with the occasional scar that spoke of years of metalwork. "Mr. Davidson?" she inquired, recognizing the name of the blacksmith her uncle had mentioned would meet her. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with silver at the temples. "Thomas Davidson, miss. Your Uncle Samuel asked me to escort you to the store. He's caught up with a supply wagon that arrived early." His eyes, the color of worn copper, held a warmth that made something flutter in her chest. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Davidson." She reached for her carpet bag, but he was already lifting it with ease. "Please, call me Thomas. Everyone does." He offered his free arm, and after a moment's hesitation she took it. "How was your journey?" "Long," she admitted, falling into step beside him, though the railway certainly made it more manageable than it would have been a few years ago. As they walked, Margaret noticed the curious glances from townspeople. A new face was always cause for interest in a small town, she supposed. Thomas nodded respectfully to those they passed, and she noted how people's faces brightened at his greeting. "I understand you're from Philadelphia," Thomas said as they navigated the wooden sidewalk. "Quite a change coming out here?" "Indeed." Margaret watched a group of children chase a hoop down the street. "Though perhaps change is what I need." He glanced at her then, something knowing in his expression. Sometimes the best things in life come from the changes we never expected to make. The general store came into view, its fresh paint and large windows making it one of the more impressive buildings on the street. Before they reached it, Thomas paused. "Miss Blackwood." "Margaret, please." A slight smile touched his lips. "Margaret, I want you to know that while Silver Creek might seem rough around the edges, you'll find no better people anywhere. We look after our own here." She studied his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his expression. "Are you including me in that, Mr. Davidson?" "I believe I am." His eyes squinted at the corners when he smiled. "And it's Thomas, remember?" The moment was broken by the sound of her uncle calling her name. Samuel Blackwood stood in the doorway of the store, his familiar face creased with welcome. As Thomas handed her the carpet bag, their fingers brushed, and Margaret felt that same flutter in her chest. "Welcome to Silver Creek," Thomas said softly, replacing his hat. "I hope you'll find what you're looking for here." As Margaret watched him walk away, she couldn't help but think that perhaps she already had. The following weeks settled into a rhythm as natural as the sunrise over the mountains. Margaret found herself adapting to life in Silver Creek with surprising ease. The general store became her domain, her Eastern education proving invaluable as she organized the books and implemented a proper inventory system that had her uncle beaming with pride. Thomas Davidson became a regular visitor, though his purchases rarely seemed to justify the frequency of his appearances. He would lean against the counter, sharing stories of the town's history, while she pretended to be occupied with stocking shelves or tallying accounts. One crisp morning, as Margaret arranged a display of newly arrived coffee beans, Thomas entered the store, with purpose in his stride. "Margaret, I could use your help if you're willing." She turned, noting the unusual tension in his shoulders. "Of course. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Exactly. But Mrs. Chen's little girl is having her 10th birthday tomorrow, and I'm afraid I'm at a loss for what might make a suitable gift." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "I thought perhaps a lady's perspective might help." Margaret bit back a smile. "And you've waited until the day before to consider this?" "I admit, it's not my finest moment of planning." His sheepish expression made him look younger, more vulnerable. "Well then, let's see what we can find." She led him through the store, past shelves of practical goods to a small section of toys and trinkets. "Tell me about her. What is she like?" As Thomas described the precocious daughter of the Chinese laundry owners, Margaret noticed how his face softened when speaking of the child. This was the man who repaired the schoolhouse roof without being asked, who made sure every widow in town had firewood before winter set in. They settled on a beautifully bound book of fairy tales and a small set of colored pencils. As Margaret wrapped them in brown paper, Thomas watched her hands work with unusual intensity. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Margaret's fingers fumbled with the string. "Oh, the harvest dance is coming up next weekend. I thought perhaps," he cleared his throat. "That is, I would be honored if you would consider attending with me." She looked up to find him watching her with those copper-colored eyes, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "I would like that very much," she said, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. The night of the harvest dance transformed the town hall into something magical. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the wooden floors, and the scent of autumn flowers filled the air. Margaret wore her best dress, a deep green silk that she'd brought from Philadelphia, though she'd never imagined wearing it in a frontier town dance hall. Thomas cleaned up remarkably well, his usual work clothes replaced by a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. When he offered his hand for the first dance, Margaret felt every eye in the room upon them, but found she didn't mind at all. "You look beautiful," he murmured as they moved to the music, "like something out of a dream." "You're quite handsome yourself," she replied, enjoying the way his ears reddened at the compliment. "Though I must admit, I missed the leather apron." His laugh was rich and warm. "Do you now? Most ladies prefer a man in a suit to one covered in soot and iron filings." "I'm not most ladies." His hand tightened slightly on her waist. "No, you certainly are not." As they danced, Margaret caught glimpses of familiar faces, Miss Chen beaming at them from beside the refreshment table, her daughter wearing a new hair ribbon and clutching her book of fairy tales, old Joe Thompson nodding approvingly as he played his fiddle, even her Uncle Samuel, watching with poorly concealed satisfaction. Later, when the music slowed and the younger children had been carried home to bed, Thomas led her outside. The night air was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "I never thought I'd find something like this here," Margaret admitted, her hand still in his. "When I left Philadelphia, I thought I was leaving everything behind." Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the hall's windows. "And now I think perhaps I was finding my way forward instead." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of his evening shadow against her palm. "Sometimes the best things in life come from the changes we never expected to make." He smiled at hearing his own words quoted back to him. Then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle, almost reverent, and Margaret felt as though her heart might burst from the tenderness of it. When they parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. Margaret drew back slightly, surprised not by the question but by its timing. "That's quite sudden, Mr. Davidson." "Is it?" His thumbs traced circles on her hands. "I've known since the moment you stepped down from that stagecoach, looking at our dusty little town like it was both the most foreign and fascinating thing you'd ever seen. I've just been waiting for you to catch up." She laughed softly. "And you're certain? A Philadelphia lady with fancy ideas about bookkeeping? I've never been more certain of anything in my life." His eyes were serious now. "You make this town brighter just by being in it. You've brought order to your uncle's chaos, friendship to Mrs. Chen's daughter, and joy to a simple blacksmith's life. Marry me, Margaret Blackwood. Let's build something wonderful together." Margaret looked up at this man who had somehow become the center of her world, who had shown her that home wasn't always where you started, but where you chose to plant your roots. In his face she saw all the promises of tomorrow: morning kisses tasting of coffee, evenings spent reading by lamplight, a family gathered around a dinner table, a life built on love and respect and understanding. "Yes," she said simply, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you, Thomas Davidson." He pulled her close, kissing her with all the passion he'd held in check before. Above them, the stars continued their eternal dance, witnesses to another love story unfolding beneath their ancient light. By spring, when the wildflowers painted the meadows in many colors, Margaret Davidson stood in the doorway of her new home, watching her husband work at his forge. The ring on her finger caught the sunlight, a simple band that meant more to her than all the Philadelphia society jewels combined. She thought about the letter she'd received just yesterday from her cousin, full of concern about her exile in the West. If only they could see what she saw, not deprivation but abundance, not isolation but community, not an ending but the most beautiful beginning. Thomas looked up from his work, catching her eye. His smile, as always, made her heart skip a beat. This was where she belonged, in this town that had become her home, with this man who had become her heart. Sometimes the best stories she had learned were the ones you never expected to live,